Everybody, this is Dream, and we got a nice little 6-game college basketball slate today that starts at 6 p.m. This slate has not got a lot of value plays. Obviously, you need $6,200 for every slot on average, and it's really hard to find a lot of guys under that price point range, which is a little bit disappointing. I was really hoping there was going to be some good options here, but there really isn't. We have a couple guys listed here, but overall, it is going to be a tough slate, so do keep that in mind if you decide to play here. But there are a couple guys, and then, there's a couple, minimum price dudes that you could kind of throw a dagger at, but I don't necessarily recommend it. But you're probably going to have to mix and match some guys in order to make these lineups work. So with that said, let's get into my top picks on this particular slate. We're going to start with guards, and we're going to start with Isaiah Wong here for Miami. Now, obviously, it's super expensive here, so it is a problem, but he's only had one game under 25 fantasy points all season long. 4 games for Syracuse have all been over 22 fantasy points in his career, so he's got a really nice upside here. He also has fantasy points per minute over 1.9, which is really good. 1.09, sorry, which is really good for a guard. It's really hard to find good guards that have over 1 fantasy point per minute. He's got nice upside, great situation, and I think he's going to be one of the top plays on the slate. Then we're going to look at Terrence Shannon Jr. for Illinois. He is $8,400. He has a fantasy points per minute of 0.95. He's had one game all season long under that was really bad, but every other game has been over 22 fantasy points, and he's got a pretty good spot here in this matchup, so I think he's viable on the slate. He has nice upside, and his price is still pretty reasonable. Probably wish it was a little bit lower, though, but still okay. Then we'll look at Tyler Perry for North Texas. He's at $7,300 here. He's had a couple bad games this season, but overall he's been really good of late. He's had one game versus FIU, which was 36 fantasy points, so he's a really nice play today. He also averages 0.88 fantasy points per minute. It's pretty solid. His price point is pretty fair for what he can do here. I really do like him as a good play on the slate. Then we're going to look at Denver Jones here for FIU. He's at just $6,700, so he's a nice, interesting value-ish play. He's had only 2 games all season long under 25 or under 20 fantasy points rather. He has some pretty good upside here, and he's played North Texas once in his career, having 28 fantasy points in that game. He's one of my favorite plays on the slate simply because he has nice upside and not a ton of downside here. Then we'll look at Michael Forrest for Florida Atlantic. Now he's a little bit more risky because he is coming off the bench, but he's only had 2 games all season long under 10 fantasy points, and he's had 4 games versus Western Kentucky where in all 4 of those games he had at least 17 fantasy points, and he's averaging 0.81 fantasy points per game. So if you need a value play, he's one of the better value plays available. However, he is still $5,200, so it's not like we just need him to get 10 fantasy points to pay off. He does need to get a little bit more than that. But he does have some upside here, and so he is viable on this particular slate. Then we're going to look at the forwards that we like today, and we're going to start with Jesse Edwards. He's obviously the most expensive player at the forward position. He has only had a couple games under 35 fantasy points today. He's been ridiculously good all season long. He has 45 to 50 fantasy point upside. He's had one game against Miami of Florida in his career, and he had over 45 fantasy points in that one. He's also averaging a ridiculous 1.17 fantasy points per game. As you can see, he does have double-double potential as well, though he has missed that a couple times recently, but he still has nice upside, and he's probably the top play overall on the slate, especially with the maximum upside that he has. Then we're going to look at Max Fielder here for Rice. Now, he's got an interesting matchup here against UTSA, which is Texas San Antonio. He's had one terrible game early in the season, and he doesn't always have the most consistent minutes, but he's been getting over 30 fantasy points rather, in nearly all games this season. He has a few under that, but for the most part, he's been extremely good. He's got some good upside for this price, and in his 4 games in his career against Texas San Antonio, he's had 32 fantasy points or more. In all those games, he's also averaging 1 fantasy point per minute, throughout the season so far this year, so he's a great option on the slate. A little bit more of a risky option is KJ Buffin for UAB. He hasn't been particularly perfect this year, but he does have decent upside. He has inconsistent minutes, but he's been over 10 fantasy points in every single game this year, In 4 games versus Middle Tennessee, he's had at least 19 fantasy points, though he has played 5 games and he had one bad one against them. But, that's in his career, so that could be in the last couple of years. With that said, he is averaging 0.94 fantasy points per game, so he does have some nice upside here. Then we're going to look at Vlad Golden. Golden is an interesting option today as a decent value play. He's got some good upside here with most of his games, over 20 fantasy points this season. He's only had a couple under it. His price is pretty decent here. He's had 2 games versus Western Kentucky in his career. One of those 12 fantasy points and 128. He is averaging 1.1 fantasy point per minute, which is really good. And so he does have some nice upside here. However, he hasn't really been getting the double-doubles much this season. He definitely gets close on the points, but doesn't usually get all the way on rebounds. But a lot to do with the minutes situation, where he only gets around 25 or so minutes. He is a good play, but he is a little bit risky as a result of the minute situation. And then finally, last but not least, Nick Gardarama for FIU. Now, he has an interesting situation here. In his last 3 games, he's ramped up his minutes a lot, and he's had double-digit points in those 3. He's only had a couple games under 10 fantasy points all season long, and he's a pretty decent price, though he only averages 0.7 fantasy points per minute. But he has been getting more minutes lately. As you can see, in 4 of the last 5 games, he had at least 30 minutes. If that trend continues, then he's going to be viable on the slate. But he is a little bit risky because that could be a little bit of a fluke. But overall, he is a good play on this one, and I think he's viable as somebody to take in consideration. Now, that's what I have for the slate, guys. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.